Welcome to another edition of Civil War Reflections with Brian Steele Wills. Today we're going to learn about one of those lesser known figures who nevertheless was a very prominent and important figure in the American Civil War, and that is George Henry Thomas. I grew up in Suffolk, Virginia, which was the county just over from or next to Southampton County, which is where George Thomas was born. He was born on July 31st, 1816, one of the middle children in a family that had a lot of sisters. And he, because of that, I think, learned to sort of navigate through the landscape of a middle child, because you have the oldest ones getting attention and the youngest ones getting attention. So in some ways, his personality was a quieter personality, a studious personality, just a very sincere and dependable individual. Everyone who would comment about him, the word dependable gets used quite a lot, someone who could be counted on. He grew up, of course, in an area that had slaves. The area that he was born in and lived in had become famous for a slave rebellion by Nat Turner in 1831. Of course, Thomas would have been a young person, and they had to flee their home to try to get out of the way of, we'll say out of harm's way in that famous slave rebellion. So he had a lot of experience with the institution of slavery, although certainly not one to embrace it. He was supposed to have given books to some of the young slave children, and he just, I think, never really bought into the kind of system that flourished in the cotton states and the slave or black belt of these states, of which Southampton County would be a part. He was educated at West Point, the United States Military Academy, appointed in 1836. He got a recommendation from a congressman that said, basically, I'm going to send you, and I don't want to hear anything bad about what happens from you or with you. And he really did do well at West Point in terms of being studious and dedicated to his education. They said, though, that when he was called to do the work at the blackboard, that his hand shook as he tried to draw whatever it was that he was being asked to draw and comment on the board. He certainly was not comfortable giving speeches or comfortable in public settings where he was called upon to play a role of that type. Much more of a quiet sort of person, an introverted type person. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1840. He had a ranking of 12th in the class, and the most famous person who was in the class as well was William Tecumseh Sherman. He got to know Sherman, and they became, of course, associated later on in the war. He also was in the same class as a not well-known Confederate figure who will be a Confederate figure named Paul Hebert. He served in the military in the artillery, and was involved in a number of different places where he got service or he got exposed to service in, again, harm's way. He, for instance, engaged in operations against the Seminoles in Florida, and then more famously for him, involved in the Mexican-American War, where he won brevets for captain and major. You come out of the U.S. Military Academy as a lieutenant, you have to work your way up. Well, in the Mexican-American War, he served a battery, served an artillery unit that was involved in the battles of Monterrey and Buena Vista. At Buena Vista, he was famous for being part of the same artillery that included Braxton Bragg, and supposedly Bragg was told by his commander, give him some more grape, Bragg, and he and Bragg were successful in helping the Americans win. The Battle of Monterrey had been basically a street fight, very deadly and very difficult street fight, in which the defending Mexican troops were able to get up on these flat roofs of the buildings and fire at the Americans as they tried to maneuver into narrow streets. Well, he was involved in that as well, and then Buena Vista came after that. Again, one of the things that he'll be famous for is being in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, and he gets to be there an officer. He is out west doing court-martial duty. One of the people that he did court-martial duty was with Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was they were in the same, billeted in the same home, in the same house, he in one corner and Lee in the other. And one of the things that Thomas will do is marry a little later in life, and he is contemplating bringing his wife to Texas, and Lee sort of says, this would be a very difficult place for someone to be that doesn't have to be here. And that was kind of a thought that I guess they tried it in that circumstance, but won't try it again in the American Civil War. In the American Civil War, once he bids his wife farewell, he does not see her again. He talks to her, of course, he communicates, but he doesn't see her. He also, of course, was involved in training the cadets at the U.S. Military Academy. Ended up being an instructor of artillery and cavalry there. And it's where he got his name, Slow Trot. One of the things that's thought about Thomas was that he would be an individual who was very meticulous and very, you could almost say, plodding in the way that he maneuvered. And so you think maybe the term slow trot would come from that, but it doesn't. Of course, his characteristics made that even more, stand out even more. But Thomas got the name Slow Trot supposedly because at West Point, while he's training these individuals in cavalry maneuvers in a building that has, inside the building is an arena, and in that arena they have columns. And he didn't want the riders to smash into the columns if they lost control of the horse that they were riding. So it would hurt potentially the rider, and it would hurt the horse. So he was constantly admonishing them to slow trot. Don't gallop, don't canter, but slow trot. So that's where that term comes from. He has a lot of nicknames, and that's the most famous of the nicknames, and it probably fits his personality as much as anything, although some of the others are very typical of the way soldiers looked at the officers. And for instance, he was known as Old Pap or Pap Thomas, just a lot of different nicknames that were associated with soldiers once the war took place, including two famous nicknames that he'll get for his service in the Civil War. At any rate, on his way back from Texas, he was actually, one of the other things that happened in the pre-war years, he was wounded. The only time he'll be wounded in combat by an arrow shot by a Comanche warrior that actually struck him in the chest. He was able to pull it out and continue to maneuver and continue to come back mounted. So he was not debilitated by that wound, but I'm sure it took a little time to heal and was painful. So don't want to dismiss it, but that was the only time he was wounded, and it didn't knock him out of action or threaten his life. But on the way back from Texas, he's on a train, and the long train ride was difficult and I'm sure tedious and whatnot. And so he got off the train to stretch his legs, and unfortunately, in the dark, he did not see that where he was beginning to go to stretch his legs was not a flat surface, it was a deep drop. And he took that step into the air, as it were, and down he went. And when he hit bottom, he wrenched his back. And so one of the more debilitating injuries that he will ever suffer is this injury to his back by an accident of simply getting innocently off a train to stretch your legs. He will be so stove up by that. And again, you can imagine if you've ever been hurt and you've hurt your back or your feet or something like that, everything hurts. You know, you can't rest, you can't stand, you can't walk, you can't sit with any comfort when you've got that kind of an injury. So at any rate, it was enough of a blow that there was some doubt as to whether he would be able to return to active service. So he began to contemplate what he might do if he could not return to active service. And one of the possibilities was to teach at the Virginia Military Institute, and there was some communication along that line. A lot of people will later on use that to suggest that he was anti-union because he was born in Virginia and he'd actually sought employment at the Virginia Military Institute. But of course, all of that is not true, because while he did communicate with officials, while he did contemplate that, he will, at the end of the day, stay in the Union. He's one of those rare Southern-born individuals who stays with the Union. There were some other famous ones that did as well. David Farragut, Winfield Scott. These were all Southern-born people that stayed in the Union. There were people from the North that went south. So officers who married Southern women or for other reasons went south. John Pemberton was one. Samuel French was one. And there were always suspicions. There were suspicions about Thomas. There were suspicions about Pemberton and French, that these were people not born on the side that they chose to fight for. But by virtue of the removing of officers ahead of him, including Robert E. Lee, he is going to advance to the ranks of lieutenant colonel and colonel in the cavalry unit before in the a famous cavalry unit, that 2nd U.S. Cavalry. He's going to move up in rank, and so in some ways the choices of others does benefit him, but he's doing things in the traditional way. He's not got any boosters. He's not got any congressmen that will help, or senators that will help elevate his career or take his name and put it in prominent places. He is doing this traditionally, is doing this conventionally, and that was Thomas. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of person that would sell himself or promote himself, but he would not turn down advancement if it was in the appropriate way. Now, if it was under other circumstances, maybe not, but under those circumstances, he would take his advancement in line just like anybody else. One of the figures that becomes famous in that sort of early period, though lost to history and probably, frankly, lost for good reason, was a general named Robert Patterson, and Thomas is associated with him in the early days of the war. one of the engagements they fought was Falling Waters, and in the eastern, what became the Eastern Theater of the American Civil War, he will fight there. But most of the rest of his time, in fact, all of the rest of his time, will be in the Western Theater. So he's in the Eastern Theater for only a very brief period of time. So I jump ahead a little bit, but when others are making the choice, when secession and war breaks out, secession first and then war, although after Sumter and Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers, those volunteers to come out as quotas from all of the states that were not in rebellion at that time to wage war on those who were. Virginia, among other border states, slaveholding border states, will decide to leave the Union, secede from the Union as well. So the Confederate States of America formed before Fort Sumter, firing on Fort Sumter, then has these additional states join it. But Thomas, although his state has seceded and joined the Confederacy, ended up having the Confederate capital moved from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia. Thomas stays with the Union. So he is engaged in some of those early skirmishes and fights up in the northern part of Virginia, and ends up transferring to the West. And when he comes to the West, one of his first responsibilities is to try to do something with recruiting. Kentucky was neutral, declared neutrality, and so a lot of things had to be done sort of surreptitiously. But once the Confederates moved into Columbus, Kentucky, that area under Polk and Gideon Pillow, Leonidas Polk and Gideon Pillow, then the state goes for the Union. And from that point, individuals like Ulysses Grant moves into Paducah, other troops move into other areas, and then they begin to move south from there. And so Kentucky becomes a blue state, if you want to call it that. And one of the problems for Thomas is that he's got to try to take all of these individuals, these volunteers who have never had military service, and put them into condition to fight a war. And this was true for all sorts of commanders in all sorts of places. So Thomas was not unique about that. But one of the things he did, and I said he didn't like to give speeches, there were political figures and others who were coming to these camps, and they were giving martial speeches to encourage the recruits and to bolster morale. And Thomas says, what does a man want to give a speech for, and refuses to do it? So he doesn't play that game, and he's really that way throughout his career. But his first major battle is January 1862 against a force under a gentleman by the name of Crittenden, but also directly more a force under the name of Felix Zollicoffer, one of the great names of the Civil War, Felix Zollicoffer, who was a pre-war newspaper editor and fire eater. He was really anxious to do battle. And in January 1862, the decision is made to cross the Cumberland River, build a base camp from which you can operate, and then go into some part of central Kentucky. So if you're from the area, you call it Middle Tennessee and Central Kentucky. So they're going to move into Central Kentucky, though. The problem is that there's federal troops there under Thomas and another federal force under Albin Sheff, but not spelled like the cook. It starts with an S, but Albin Sheff is going to be trying to join with Thomas, and the combination of those troops will make that a fairly formidable force. Thomas has a number of troops, but it will be even bigger. And so Zollicoffer, anxious to do battle, is going to want to strike at Thomas before that can be done. And they go toward the area that was got the name of Nancy, and the local, also the name of Logan's Crossroads, and then finally, of course, Mill Springs is how it's better known and well known today. During the rain, during a very early part of the day, the Confederates come up. They strike some of Thomas's troops. They're somewhat effective in trying to drive them, but Thomas is not flummoxed, or he's not flustered by this attack. He's going to rally his troops. They're not really pushed that far. And then for the Confederates, one of the unfortunate circumstances that Felix Zollicoffer, who is wearing this long raincoat type outer garment that hides his uniform, rides up to the Union troops because he thinks that they're Confederate and he doesn't want them to fire at the Confederates in a case of friendly fire. And they think he's Union, so when he tells them to stop firing, they stop firing. So it's kind of one of those oddball moments. But unfortunately, an aide comes up to Zollicoffer, "General, those are the enemy," and then shoots at one of the Union officers and hits his horse. That Union officer was a man named Speed, and Speed Fry is going to, of course, order his men to return fire, and Zollicoffer, the aide, and one other are struck down. Zollicoffer, the most famous of the individuals struck down by the counterfire by Speed Fry and his troops. So Zollicoffer is killed. He's his body is going to ultimately be returned for burial, but he's no longer able to sustain the attack that he's led. And so the troops, while that's probably not the predominant reason they lose, begin to, of course, suffer from lack of command authority. A bayonet attack by the Union troops is probably as much as anything responsible for driving them from the field, although Thomas has really started to bring the troops together and does a masterful job of breaking the tide of this Confederate advance and then driving them back to their base camp at Beech Grove along a now rain-swollen Cumberland River. They fight. It's miles back to this base camp. They fight along the way. Thomas's troops, of course, are also disorganized by the attack. They have casualties too. So it's like everything else. Losers are demoralized and broken, but winners on a battle are usually not that much better off. And so when the Confederates retreat to their base camp, which has earthwork fortifications, Thomas's troops come and he orders them to halt. The idea being to bring up the rest of his forces, to get everything reorganized, to get the ammunition replenished, to get the unit cohesion back together, and then the next day to basically say to the Confederates, "You're trapped and you should surrender." Well, unfortunately, during the night, there's a paddle wheel steamboat called the Noble Ellis, and the Noble Ellis pulls off a large portion of the troops from this base camp and brings them, ferries them across the Cumberland River, and they disperse. So the army dissolves, but it is basically a force that's already beaten, but they're going to not continue their cohesion or reassemble. They're just going to sort of break up. So in some ways, Thomas is responsible for the breakup of a Confederate army, and that's not, again, unusual for him. So one of the things that he will do is then try to set up this attack for the next day, only to find out the next morning that the Confederates for the most part, except for stragglers, some wounded, etc. For the most part, they're gone. The enemy has fled. And the same Speed Fry that had shot Felix Zollicoffer or been responsible for the shooting of Felix Zollicoffer, the same Speed Fry comes up and says, "Why didn't you attack last night when you had the chance?" And Thomas, I think, gives one of the things that makes you think of his character, his honesty. He could have used every excuse in the book. He had the excuses I've mentioned already of a breakup of unit cohesion, of needing new ammunition, of bringing people stepping up and organizing the troops, because of losses, et cetera, et cetera. You can think about every reason they're exhausted from pursuing the Confederates for miles to the base camp. And so Thomas looks at Speed Fry when Fry asks him, "Why didn't you attack last night?" He said, "Hang it, Fry, I didn't think of it." So had he thought about it, it just didn't come to his mind that maybe that's what he should do. This is one of the things that I think separates him from a Ulysses Grant or a William T. Sherman. These would have been the ones who would have probably continued to push, whereas Thomas wants to get everything prepared so that the push may not be necessary. You can get the troops trapped to surrender. Unfortunately, they're not as trapped as he thought they were because of the noble Ellis. But he wins a victory, January 1862, and yet there's no nickname from that battle. There's no nickname associated with that. In February, the Confederates will be attacked by Ulysses Grant. The first place he's not really involved because his troops can't get into position before the Navy comes up on February 6th and takes out Fort Henry, which had mostly been evacuated by the Confederates except for enough men to serve the guns and the wounded or the ill, I should say, those people sick who could not be moved. And so that force is not really a full garrison. It takes a pounding because the Navy guns can almost fire at a par with the Confederate tubes. The biggest Confederate gun gets knocked out of action. So one of the problems with Fort Henry, if you look at it today, you're going to have some scuba gear or you're going to be prepared to at least be thoroughly wet because it's underwater. And that was part of the problem. It was located on a low plain that flooded. With all the rain that had swollen the Cumberland River, you also had rain that swamped Fort Henry. So Fort Henry is going to be forced to surrender. Grant's then going to go across this peninsula of ground over to Fort Donelson. And at Fort Donelson, he is going to fight a battle that's a multi-day battle that ends up giving the Federals the surrender of that garrison and Ulysses Grant the name that goes with his supposed letters of his name. He was really Hiram Ulysses Grant, but you don't hug much and get much from that. But if you have U.S. Grant because of Ulysses Simpson, supposedly Grant, then you have a potential for something good with unconditional surrender being the terms you give the Confederates that now have lost two of their leaders that have fled, Gideon Pillow and John Floyd, and one Confederate who has been able to escape before the surrender has to be made before hostilities stop, and that's Nathan Bedford Forrest, who takes his force out and famously rides in water that is freezing, in saddle skirt deep water, but gets out of Fort Donelson to live to fight another day. So Simon Buckner is the one who actually surrenders to Grant. He had hoped to get better terms because he had lent Grant money and he thought that Grant might be more generous to him, but Grant said nothing but unconditional surrender, and he became unconditional surrender Grant. So in February, these two big battles changed Grant's trajectory, and the Battle of Mill Springs, which had been a total victory for the Union, does not really do the same for George Thomas. But at any rate, he goes on to service in a number of battles in the Western Theater before the most famous one that he's engaged with at Chickamauga, Georgia. And so it's really at Chickamauga, Georgia, that he wins the name that he'll be remembered for the most. But probably one of the battles that precedes that again illustrates his character, is the Battle of Stones River that takes place at the end of 62 and into 63. The battle there has started poorly for the Federals. They have been driven back, especially on one of their flanks, and the Federals are looking at a situation that could get worse. And Thomas helps to give sort of a stiffer backbone to that when he's asked, or when he is in a conference, in a sort of a huddle, you might say, with the various, of course, commanders there, William Stark Rosecrans and others. The question is, what do we do? Do we retreat? And Thomas supposedly is sort of dozing. He wakes up and he says, this army doesn't retreat. And he says there's no better place to die than here. So that sort of gives a little bit of a boost in spirit to the Union forces. And when they rally, the battle turns in their favor ultimately, especially to have a one day of battle, a day off from battle, and then another day of battle. That last day of battle is really lopsided in favor of the Union, where Union artillery just chews up troops that are trying to flank it under John C. Breckinridge. And so the Battle of Stones River shows sort of the determination of Thomas and his ability to sort of convey that kind of quiet confidence. But it's at Chickamauga that he gets his most famous nickname, when inadvertently there's a gap created because of ordering one of the Union commanders, a man named Wood, who is ordered to fill what is supposed to be a gap, only the gap doesn't exist until he moves and creates one. And just at the same time, troops that have been brought from Robert E. Lee's army, the Army of Northern Virginia, and moved to Georgia, got off the trains and marched over to Chickamauga. Those troops under James Longstreet will make an attack at that position that's been vacated by Wood, and they break through and collapse the Union center and the Union right flank. Included in the retreat is Rosecrans himself, and there will be the comment made derogatorily about him almost being like someone hit on the head like a stunned duck. But he will retreat to Chattanooga in part to try to reposition so that they can try to reorganize the army. But when he vacates the position, that leaves the left flank exposed to multiple attacks from multiple angles. Now, Union artillery and other troops do help slow down the Confederate advance. If you go to Chickamauga, you actually have to leave the sort of main tour road to go back to where you'll see ground that some of these troops will help slow the Confederate advance down. But what really slows and ultimately stops the Confederate attacks is an area called Snodgrass Hill. Snodgrass Hill was named for the Snodgrass family. The Snodgrass cabin is there. And also there was a kind of odd ridge-like ground called Horseshoe Ridge that is next to Snodgrass Hill. So you have Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge, and that's where Thomas reassembles, takes a lot of his own troops and the remnants of others who have fled that ended up coming to join him, and ultimately get some other help with ammunition brought up and a few fresh troops under a general. It looks like Steedman, but it's pronounced Stedman. He's got a Steedman, but it's actually pronounced Stedman. Stedman comes up, and Thomas is so thrilled to see him that he almost makes an uncharacteristic gesture of affection for him, knowing that he's come to help. Thomas was very stoic. On the battlefield, he didn't show a lot of emotion. He was cool, he was calm, and that was another characteristic that was very important in circumstances like this when others were losing their heads. Thomas was keeping his. When he was nervous, they said he would stroke his chin whiskers up, and when he was calm, he would smooth his whiskers down. So you can imagine a bearded general that's got his hands just kind of in motion, almost without thought, stroking his beard. And I'll say at this point, I can guarantee he would be stroking it up, because this was a very difficult and delicate situation. But because he's able to hold the ground for at least the rest of that day of fighting, he comes to be known most famously as the Rock of Chickamauga. After that, and he ultimately pulls back to Chattanooga. Of course, you kind of do it in stages and steps, but he gets back to Chattanooga, and he ends up being given the command of the Army of the Cumberland when William Rosecrans is removed from command. And George Thomas, who is not always at his best when something happens that he's not prepared for, has a sudden visitor show up from the West named Ulysses Grant, and there's some thought that he was not solicitous of his visitor. But one of the things about Thomas was that if he knew Grant was coming, he would have made all preparations to receive him. When he didn't know he was coming, I think it threw him off his game a little. Some people have interpreted that as hostility toward Grant. I do not think that's the case. The difference between Grant and Thomas was the way they waged war. Grant was very aggressive in the sense that he would take troops and keep pushing and pushing, a bulldog almost in his approach to the way he fought. Very much like Sherman, very much like Philip Sheridan. These were why these individuals bonded so well. And other reasons, they had been, Sherman and Grant had both been at Shiloh, and Shiloh almost put Grant out of action. He was limited in his role after that by Henry Halleck at the operations that ultimately end up in coming slowly and meticulously toward Corinth. And by that point, the Confederate troops at Corinth under Beauregard will pull out of Corinth, and it becomes a siege that ends up not, again, bringing any great luster to the individuals involved. Well, by the time, of course, you get to this point in the war, Grant has had his spectacular operations against Vicksburg and has certainly put himself on the map. And now he's coming to take command in Chattanooga. And as I said, Thomas doesn't greet him in the way that some of the staff members of Grant and some of the others, the gossipers like James Harrison Wilson, will say that was latent kind of hostility on Thomas's part, when that was not true. He had just been caught off guard, so to speak, unprepared. But Grant wants him to attack, and they have been under very difficult circumstances of having their rations cut. And it's not the kind of situation where Thomas feels the army is really ready or able to launch an attack that would drive the Confederates away. And I think, again, that sort of made Grant feel that Thomas is not going to wage war the way I want it. But Thomas was doing the right thing. If you send the army in when it's not ready, you're going to have a disaster, and things are going to be worse than they were before. If you give the army time to get together, get the situation straight, ultimately you can change things. The only path of rations coming into Chattanooga was a very long and difficult trail that also got hit by Fighting Joe Wheeler occasionally, bringing in Confederates attacking the Union troops trying to bring in supplies. The water route was cut off because the Confederates held Lookout Mountain and the area around it, as well as Missionary Ridge. And ultimately, a spectacular move by bringing troops, floating them down toward Brown's Ferry, and then landing the troops and seizing that point from which they can then use a bridgehead to sort of think about attacking Lookout Mountain and opening up the supply line. All of that, again, ultimately comes about giving the Army the chance to redeem itself after Chickamauga. When the Federals cross at Brown's Ferry, the next big fight is a night battle. It's very unusual in the Civil War in the Wauhatchie Valley, and that's not anything that Thomas has a role in, but that's part of what keeps the Confederates kind of from being able to secure their, quote, siege of Chattanooga. And ultimately, Joe Hooker and others will take Lookout Mountain, and then it's Thomas's troops who push on first to Orchard Knob and then use the ground there to launch the attack against Missionary Ridge. But the hero of the battle is supposed to be William Tecumseh Sherman. He is the one who's brought in by Grant to get this job done, and he is going to attack the Confederate right and marches his men in secret maneuvering that the Confederates, he hopes, will not see, and that they really don't see. But they come against a formation of ground that Sherman's not familiar with. It's sort of two ridges back to back in that sector. And the Confederates end up defending that line pretty well. They don't have that first ridge that well defended, but they have the second one, the main one, very well defended around a place called Tunnel Hill. And the troops that did the best work there were under Patrick Cleburne. We've talked about Cleburne on one of the other podcasts. But Thomas is going to have his men ultimately, supposedly, attack the base of Missionary Ridge. There are Confederate rifle pits out in front of Missionary Ridge. And it was my friend Jim Ogden who did the best job of explaining all of that to me. In one of our tours, we got to know that battle so much better because that battle was, I had the notion that there were troops sort of literally at the base of the mountain, and they were actually out in front of it a little bit. And because of that, when you capture those rifle pits, you can't stay there because the Confederate artillery on top of Missionary Ridge can reach you. It's better to either pull back, which you don't want to do, or go forward. So without orders, that's one of the points about this, was that Thomas didn't direct the assault on Missionary Ridge. It happened. And Grant was a little perturbed about that, was very perturbed, I should say. And ultimately, it doesn't matter because it's not Sherman who breaks the Braxton Bragg's line at Missionary Ridge. It's Thomas's men. And they come up that ridge, ultimately drive the Confederates back, and the Federals receive or hold the command of Missionary Ridge. So they've now literally broken the total Confederate defense line at Lookout Mountain first, and then Missionary Ridge, which Thomas is associated with. The Confederates will have a brilliant defense at Ringgold Gap by Pat Cleburne that keeps the Federals from pushing too much further, and things settle down until the next year. In 1864, Thomas will be involved in the Atlanta campaign. He'll be involved ultimately at Hood's advance into Tennessee. But given the time, let's wait and talk about the Atlanta campaign, Thomas's role there, including Kennesaw Mountain and Peachtree Creek especially. But we'll save that for another podcast. So thanks for listening, and hope that you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about a real hero. One of the men that wrote about Union generals was a man that was famous for giving sort of the capsules of those figures, and he did generals in blue and generals in gray. His name was Ezra Warner, and Ezra Warner calls Thomas the third of the triumvirate that won the war with Ulysses Grant and William T. Sherman. He puts Thomas in that category. So we'll wait till next time and talk about the Atlanta campaign and Hood's attempt to try to recapture a momentum in Tennessee in 1864 and see how Thomas handles those situations. For now, have a good day. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.